This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. This week, the silver tsunami of seniors looking for nice places to live, creating a $275 billion hole that needs to be filled. Plus, President Trump wants to eliminate the Department of Education. What would that mean, and how much would it save? And what the next Trump administration will mean for the banking system, and what it's already meant for the world of Bitcoin. But we begin with a story of second acts, a story of reinvention, of repurposing, and the future of America's shopping malls in the growing age of e-commerce. It's the busiest time of the year for shopping, a time that in the past would have seen the Berkshire Mall in Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, packed to the gills.
So the mall was built in the early 70s. It was in its heyday, especially at this time of the year, the time between Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was packed. Our police department would go out and assist with traffic control.
As borough manager for Wyomissing, Michelle Baer saw the Berkshire Mall in its glory days. But the story today is very different.
Tenancy, I would say, is about 60%. So, I mean, just the visual of walking through it compared to even a decade ago when, again, at this time of the year, you would be body checking people trying to get from store to store versus as of today, I would say 60 to 70% of the parking lot is fenced off.
What's happened in Wyomissing is far from unique. Across the country, America's love affair with shopping malls has cooled. It was an affair driven by the passion of consumers, a passion to buy, but also to buy alongside others sharing that passion.
It's the emotional connection. So let's not forget why people shop, why women primarily shop, right? So 85% of consumption generally occurs from the female side of things.
Adrienne Yee is a retail analyst at Barclays and has followed the business for nearly 20 years.
Back in the day, it was the social outlet, and that hasn't necessarily gone away. Unfortunately, we have all this social media where people don't socialize in a public space. The US consumption is the most oversupplied in the world. So pre-pandemic, or I should say actually pre-GFC, so we had approximately 7 square feet of retail space per capita. Now you compare that to, in Europe, it's about $1 or 1 square foot to 1.5 square feet per capita. And then obviously in Asia, it's significantly lower than that.
The U.S. hasn't lost its passion to consume, and it still has a lot of retail space. But there's a good deal less of that space than there used to be. In the 1980s, there were approximately 2,500 malls in the country. Today, fewer than 1,000, raising the question of how far it could go, whether malls could simply disappear altogether.
We don't think they're dying. The better malls have a place in the market, and we think what's left, we don't think they're all gonna die. However, there are some that will probably die in the future.
Yigal Namdar's company owns some 80 of the malls that remain, and he says they can still be a good investment, provided they're the right malls. When you look for an investment in a mall, what's the profile you look for?
Well, look for a great location, a good market, strong market, a growing market. We look at the mix of tenants in the mall, occupancy, who the anchors are, sales of tenants, the trend, and we hope we can, buy more as we go on.
We may be seeing a natural correction in the number of malls pulling back from their peak, but that correction has been turbocharged by the rise of e-commerce.
E-commerce as a percent of sales from 2010 to about 2015 was just hugging 10%. Hugging, 10. And then from 17 to 19, it went from 10 to 30. It was that S-curve of adoption where all of a sudden it was like, oh, why? Because this generation demanded it of Amazon and all these other things. So now we're in the era where this next 2 decades of consumption is everything that I pick, that I want, that is going to land at my doorstep when I blink when I snap my fingers or I blink my eyes, like Genie.
If it went to 30% in 2019, I think you said, right? Mm-hmm. What happened with the pandemic and where is it now?
In 1 year, so that 30%, which is kind of like specialty, more like specialty, like on-mall retail, less so in furniture and more so in apparel, but generally that number is 30%. It flipped. In 2020, it went to 70-30.
70% e-commerce, 30% bricks and mortar.
Because you couldn't go to the stores. And then what happened is it sort of like kind of ratcheted down sort of in 2021 and 2022. And so it's now kind of at a level playing field where it's kind of more like 40-45% e-commerce, and it's heading to 50-50.
Can you envision a world in which actually bricks and mortar start eating back into e-commerce?
My view is that a 50-50 world is about right. Because a 50-50 world will be about 500 stores, so to, kind of in that range.
Which malls get hit the hardest by the retrenchment depends on the type of mall involved. Not all U.S. shopping malls are created equal. They come in 3 basic classes. A Class A mall is one that makes at least $500 per square foot a year. Research from Capital One says their average vacancy rate is just 3.6%, and they're largely doing just fine. On the other extreme, Class C malls average less than $300 per square foot per year and have much higher vacancy rates. That leaves Class B malls right in the middle, which is where Namdar likes to be, given their availability and the bigger difference between what they cost and the revenue they can generate, which investors call the cap rate.
What we like to invest in is the B or B plus malls. Those are malls that they do well, but they're one level below the A. And there we feel that there's an arbitrage in the cap rates that you could buy them at much more attractive cap rates than the A, and maybe a little bit less than the C's that we feel don't have much life left in them.
If I own a B mall, is it possible for me to do something to make that into an A mall?
Simply, no. Because the A mall designation is based on the sort of 5-mile radius of income, density, demographic. Okay, I want an income demographic in that 5-mile radius that makes $75,000 to $100,000. Now I can go look for my malls. So the designation of the A or the B is actually based on the wealth. So if you think that an area will in 10 years become more wealthy, then you're going to make that bet, because these leases are also 10 years long.
If a mall owner can't change the demographics of its immediate surroundings, what can it do to improve its investment? What can be done to save a struggling mall?
Now our main focus is to do joint venture with a developer and bring someone in and say, let's go as a partner and we can repurpose it, whether it's for residential, for, hospital, for, industrial, hotel, mixed use, other types of retail, big boxes, junior anchors. So that's what we're trying to do. But in some cases, we just would sell it if there isn't a demand for that joint venture.
Which takes us back to the Berkshire Mall in Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, which has become something of a problem for borough manager Ware and for its owner, which turns out to be none other than Yigal Namdar. The average income within a mile of the Berkshire Mall is close to $130,000, but that's just 7,000 people. Zoom out 5 miles and the average income drops to $73,000 a year across almost 200,000 people.
I believe the highest assessed value was in the mid $50 million range. That coupled with mercantile tax, you were looking at probably anywhere between $400,000 to $700,000 in annual tax revenue. Compare that to the most recent reassessment that dropped it down to $5 million. So you can do the math on 400 to 700,000 lowered to 10%. I mean, that's, if you're talking in terms of our overall budget, current annual operating budget is around $30 million. 400,000 is the amount we spend annually on televising and repairing our water mains, or that's a third of our annual street improvement budget. So that amount could have a significant impact when you're talking about services the borough can provide and tax revenue that's being generated.
Berkshire's owner recognizes the problem. He says he shares the community's goal of getting revenue from the property and tax payments up, but that sometimes the issue lies with the local government and difficulties in getting timely approval of plans to redevelop.
I think that if you have a good use that's going to help the city and help the developer, the landlord, maybe we can expedite things where we can make that happen quicker. I hate to see certain assets sit empty for years and years till you get the zoning approved, the entitlements. I hope that there's a way that everybody can work together and maybe expedite it, because the ultimate goal is to have that land repurposed into a new class that is ideal for the community, for the city, for us, for everybody.
The intent was to redevelop it. The borough quickly found out that current ownership, that's not how they operate. They instead buy properties and effectively sit on them. So the redevelopment plan that I think the community and borough council expected to see obviously has not happened, much to the dismay of most everyone who just kind of sits back and watches it continue to further deteriorate.
However things ultimately work out for the Berkshire Mall, all parties recognize the need to repurpose the property for a changed world of retailing, and they all see potential yet to be realized.
I don't think shopping centers as a whole are a dying breed, and 20 years from now, you're going to see every single one of them repurposed. There's clearly development going on.
It just takes a while, but our intent is to work together with the towns and cities as much as we can, work together as a team to redevelop these assets into something that will hopefully be here for the next 100-some-odd years.
Adapting to the wants and needs of the current generation and those that come after them will be the key to the long-term health of the shopping mall and the key to a successful second act. Still ahead, how America is preparing for the silver tsunami. That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about a tsunami, an overwhelming wall, not of water, but of people, as our population ages and needs places to live that can accommodate their particular needs and desires.
We considered probably 4 different residents, and that was before COVID. And then we looked at Murano and loved Murano.
That's Marilyn Bergstrom, an 87-year-old widow who has recently left her house in Seattle, Washington, to take up residence in an upscale senior living development.
My husband, he got lung cancer and passed away in a year. And then I stayed in the house for another year. And then I decided it was time for me to move on. Well, I had thought years ago I wanted to live in a senior living community before I had to.
Bergstrom is on the leading edge of a coming explosion in people who will seek senior living accommodations. The number of Americans over age 80 is projected to surge over the next 25 years, from 13 million today to over 32 million by 2050. And within the growing population over 75, those with annual incomes over $100,000 are growing much faster than the rest, with the highest percentage of growth coming from those with incomes over $200,000.
Demographics are definitely in our favor. I got into this business just over 30 years ago, and we talked about then this silver tsunami that was coming. Well, I'm happy to say that I'm actually seeing it happen now. You know, within the next 5 to 10 years, that aging population is actually going to be moving into senior living.
Tana Gall is one of those addressing the growing demand for high-quality senior living. She's president of Merrill Gardens, which owns and operates retirement communities in 70 locations across the United States, including Murano, which Marilyn Bergstrom now calls home. And what her company provides goes well beyond just a place to live.
We define senior living as a place for people to go enhance their lives once they're past the age of 62, and they're ready to downsize, or they have some need that really keeps them from living in their own home and makes them want to move into senior living. So we provide help with activities of daily living. We provide meals, housekeeping, maintenance. Probably the most important and maybe overlooked is social interaction. People who live at home alone are lonely, and we know that socialization helps you live longer, and certainly not just longer, but happier lives. Tai Chi, yoga.
All those amenities don't come cheap, particularly at the high end of what Merrill Gardens has to provide. But today there is a growing number of seniors, like Bergstrom, who can afford it.
I'm paying about $7,500 a month. That includes my car, which I like to have as long as I can drive. I feel that it's a fair price for what you get. This is far better than any place I expected to live. When I first moved in, I just felt like I was in a fancy hotel every morning that I woke up.
And Tana Gall says that as pleasant as it is for residents like Bergstrom, it should also be good business for Merrill Gardens.
I would not say it's a high margin business. It is a middle margin business. Our margins have been a little more compressed of recent since the pandemic. The pandemic was really rough on our sector, for sure. If your question had been to me, Tana, what keeps you up at night? I would have said getting enough great team members. There's a couple things that we're looking at. Number one, we are trying to attract more people into our business that don't even know we exist. So for example, we hire a lot of people from the hospitality business. It's very, very similar to running a hotel. We have also really broadened our scope in reaching out to colleges and universities.
So nice to see all of you today.
Robust demand that's about to explode. Clientele with the ability to pay high prices. A business with solid margins. All of it should make the world of senior living a truly good real estate investment. But as NICMAP's Vision CEO Eric Morton says, there's one thing holding it back: supply. His firm tracks senior housing inventory and demand.
Senior housing is really facing a watershed moment as the baby boomers begin to turn 80. Senior housing construction has been outpaced by 80+ growth since 2022, and that gap is only set to continue as the boomers grow by about 40% by the end of the decade. It's really on the supply side that the issue has manifested. So the pandemic brought inflation to construction costs, as well as a historic increase in interest rates. And the effect of that has been to make the cost of development basically out of reach for most markets. And so what's happened is the senior housing inventory growth has hit all-time lows right as demand is set to explode.
I have been fortunate enough to watch our industry go through two very big cycles. As I mentioned, back in the mid-90s, when assisted living hit Wall Street. Nobody was public before, but a bunch of companies went public in the mid to late 90s, and they built a lot of assisted living. And then we had the dot-com bust and things slowed down again. And what was good from that is it took all those buildings that we built and filled them up. And so then the supply demand was in a nice balance for quite a few years. And then when the recession hit in 08 to 10, same thing happened. We had a lot of product on the market and people weren't moving in. So now as we come into a new economic climate, it is probably the lowest I've seen on construction starts, maybe in my 30 years. So in some ways that's a little bit distressing to me, but what I'm seeing happen is everybody's filling up. Our occupancies, I'd say, as an industry are back up to about where they were before the pandemic.
Occupancy rates are back up, but now there's a risk things will go too far, that there will be a substantial shortage in available senior housing.
At the current pace, we're on track for about a $275 billion shortfall in senior housing development. I still think a lot of the challenge is frankly just projects don't pencil. So if you think about what's happened there, you're looking at construction costs that have gone up by 25 or 30%. Debt that used to be 3 or 4 is now 7 or 8. And so when you put those two together, your cost of development has gone up pretty substantially. At the same time, you're looking at what's happened to margins over that time. Well, occupancy has been down and the cost of labor has gone up. But if you dig deep and go down market by market, street corner by street corner, there are areas where occupancy is high, rates are high, and the construction cost, the equation pencils. And so we're really seeing people kind of sharpen their pencils and really go hunting for those areas that can work today, and the number of those areas that work are going to increase as demand explodes.
But if investors are going to be in a position to move in to serve that exploding demand, there have to be enough projects in development now, just waiting for the capital and the go-ahead. Tana Gall at Merrill Gardens says she's ready to move as soon as it makes sense.
It really kind of halted our development. And so, for example, I've got 2 pieces of land today that are entitled and ready to go, but I can't financially make them work yet. And from an investor standpoint, there's a lot of people who want to get involved in the sector because they're seeing what's happening down the road. But right now, the cost of capital is just too much for us at this point. We're starting to see it come down, but it's not quite where we can make a project work yet. So we're always looking for pieces of land that make sense.
To me, that's the kind of the scary scenario, is that there's markets and segments of the market across the country that have, frankly, no excess capacity. And so the impact that could have on seniors and our entire society is pretty significant. So I think that, at the end of the day, is the thing that I worry the most about.
All of which means those in the industry see an opportunity for investors to get into the senior living game now, in anticipation of that silver tsunami.
At a time when the industry needs more capital, more debt financing, to be able to go out and meet this need, we're seeing market participants that have become exhausted or maybe been beaten during this cycle. And so, really, I think there's a call to action for the nation's banks, for the nation's asset allocators, LPs, pension funds, whoever they might be, to look at this not only as an opportunity to generate an incredible return, but also an opportunity to really help the industry meet the needs of society. And so I really am hopeful that that will happen, but to the extent that we have challenges there, that's something that I'm quite worried about.
For all the challenges the senior housing industry faces, it also offers substantial rewards, financial and otherwise.
When I jumped into senior living, I didn't think I would be in it for very long, to be honest. I thought, I'll give this a try, see what it's about. Everybody told me, the people are really nice in the industry, and I thought it would be like a 6-month gig, and I literally woke up in August and I've been doing it for 30 years. And here's why I love it. It matters. I get to make a difference in people's lives every day, and it's pretty significant. So for me, it's like working with the team members. If I treat my team members great, I know they treat my residents great. And simultaneously, it's a business. We make money doing it. So that's why I love it. That's why I think it's an industry that's going to be around a long, long time.
And that, of course, is a good thing for Marilyn Bergstrom at Murano.
I'd like everything just to stay as is. I mean, everything right now is just absolutely perfect. Kids, grandkids coming for dinner and spending time here. It's a place that people like to come to. In fact, even without being invited, they just will call up and say, can I come over? And that's a really good feeling. It's like being in your own home.
Coming up, the president-elect's economic team is coming together. What will the next Trump administration mean for banks and the financial system overall? That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about plumbing, not the kind you have in your house, but the kind that lets the markets function efficiently and fairly. President-elect Trump is putting together a new team to manage the financial plumbing over the next 4 years. And it's not too soon to consider how it may change the world of U.S. financial regulation, starting with banking, as explained by Sheila Bair, who ran the FDIC during the great financial crisis. Let's start with the so-called Basel III endgame. It's been the subject of much back and forth, up and down. What might the new administration mean for the Basel III endgame?
Well, I think there's a strong likelihood it could be scrapped and certainly significantly reworked. So the 3 banking regulators that have to sign off at the Fed, you'll have continuity. Jay Powell as chair, Michael Barr vice chair of supervision. They have fixed terms and job protection. That's not the case at the OCC, where you have an acting comptroller. That's one of the big bank regulators. So that person can be replaced immediately by Mr. Trump. And then, of course, the chair of the FDIC, who's had a lot of problems and has said he will step down before Mr. Trump assumes office. So immediately you will have 2 of the 3 approving agencies being taken over by Trump appointees, and who knows, but I can only assume that they're going to take a big, long, deep relook at Basel III Endgame before they'd want to go forward, and I do think there's a chance it could just be scrapped.
With new administrators in FDIC as well as OCC, what could that mean for bank consolidation, and at what level in the banking system?
Yeah, so I think that there will be a significant change there. Both the FDIC and the OCC, particularly my former agency, and this is one area where I really did not agree with the direction they were going. They were really trying to essentially chill any bank M&A activity that would result in a bank larger than $100 billion. And I think that's just not the right approach. In times of turmoil, I mean, some level of bank consolidation activity is healthy. And we have such huge concentrations with the very largest multi-trillion-dollar institutions. To hamstring these smaller institutions from getting a little bigger to compete with them, that just creates a deeper competitive moat around these very, very large mega banks. So I do think, healthy M&A can be healthy. I think there's going to be a change in direction with that, and I can only assume they will be friendlier to bank M&A, at least at the community bank and regional bank level.
Another agency is the CFPB, an agency that during the first Trump administration didn't get a lot of love. What are we looking at under the second version of President Trump?
Well, actually, I think Kathy Kraninger was the head of the CFPB under Mr. Trump, and I think she did a fairly good job, actually. It wasn't bad under Trump 1. I think, she was a good steward of the agency. Again, not as robust as some might have liked, but I thought she did a pretty good job. So I don't know why Elon Musk is targeting this tiny agency. It's less than $700 million, the budget, that's nothing. And the funding actually comes from the Fed, it's not appropriated. And, the constituency for the CFPB is Mr. Trump's sweet spot, working families. That's who the CFPB is, mandated to serve and protect. And you may have different views about the best way to protect them in the financial services area. But those are the powers of the CFPB. And, Mr. Trump talked about lowering credit card rates down to 10%. That, I think there'd be some issues around that. But, they're trying to reduce the cost of credit cards. And by the way, we needed that agency. The lack of consumer protections was what gave us the great financial crisis. These crazy mortgages that were being made, it worked until it didn't. We had a housing market collapse, a very deep recession. We have very stable housing markets now. Home ownership now is a source of stability and wealth accumulation, not wealth stripping, the way it was in the lead up to the great housing crisis because of the lack of consumer protection. So let's not go back.
Sheila, you ran the FDIC at a very difficult time for banking history in the United States. What about bank resolution? Obviously, there's been a lot of focus on it with the failure of some very prominent regional banks. What needs to be done there?
Well, I think some of the controversy was around execution. It wasn't so much around powers. To the extent there need to be changes in the FDIC's resolution authority, one area they might want to look at, back to the issue we discussed earlier about banking concentration, is the least cost test, which basically says the FDIC needs to sell a failed bank to the highest bidder. That's a good rule, actually. You want to minimize those losses, and that depoliticizes the decision about who to sell the bank to if you just go by who's got the best bid. The problem is, again, with these very, very large banks, they are so much bigger than everybody else, have so many more resources, they can almost always outbid the smaller guys. And I have long thought that we should, at least at a minimum, restore the FDIC's emergency authority to provide temporary guarantees to uninsured deposits, at least to those that are held in transaction accounts. These are accounts that businesses have at banks to, make payroll, pay expenses. Money's going in, money's going out. They're almost always above the insured deposit limits.
It may take some time to see the effect of Donald Trump's re-election on the banking system, but the market for cryptocurrencies reacted immediately, with Bitcoin jumping more than 40% since the election, in the expectation that President Trump's team will be much more welcoming of crypto than was the Biden team. Tim Massad was chair of the CFTC under President Obama.
Well, I think it will mean we'll see a more favorable set of policies toward crypto generally. And we'll see that in a couple of ways. One is, I think we'll see a relaxation of the view that most crypto tokens and most crypto trading must comply with existing securities laws. We'll see that through actions that the SEC will take on its own, and we may see legislation that creates essentially a different and distinct framework for a lot of crypto. Secondly, I think we'll see policies that let banks interact with the crypto sector more, meaning banks can be custodians of crypto, it's easier to bank crypto firms, and banks can participate in stablecoin activities. And a third area is, in fact, stablecoins, tokens whose value is pegged to the dollar. We may very well see legislation that creates a framework for those, which both addresses their opportunities and their risks. And there will be other changes as well. I think the question, David, with all of this is, when you look at everything that happens together, are we creating a framework that encourages innovation and development of this technology in useful and responsible ways? I hope that's what we do, versus more of a laissez-faire attitude that simply lets more speculative activity take place.
People like to argue about jurisdiction, and there's been an ongoing issue between your old shop, the CFTC on the one hand, SEC on the other. Do you expect that to get resolved maybe in favor of the CFTC?
Well, I think if there's any legislation that's passed, it will give the CFTC more authority with respect to the spot market, meaning the market for cash trading of tokens. That's very important because actually neither agency today has authority over the spot market trading of crypto tokens that aren't securities. So that's important. What concerns me there is, will the CFTC be given sufficient resources to do that job? It is a small agency. The budget was stretched when I was there. It's much smaller than the SEC. And this would be a big job.
Tim, you've done a lot of thinking and writing on the subject for cryptocurrencies. If you were to give some advice to the incoming Trump administration in dealing with these, would you say you should think about them as an asset class or a technology?
Well, that's an excellent question, David. I do think of it more as a technology, meaning blockchain is a way to record information, to record ownership, and to transfer ownership. And tokenization, is a way to facilitate that. And so when you really think about what's the long-run value of this technology, I think of it in terms of tokenizing other assets that actually have an underlying value, whether that's treasury securities, stocks, bonds, or in the case of stablecoins, they're essentially representations of the dollar. And that's why I think if you think of it as a technology, then you say, okay, what are the rules that govern those underlying assets? And how can we encourage the use of tokenization and blockchain to move those assets consistent with those rules, as opposed to thinking of it as an asset class, meaning any token is part of the same asset class.
We are also hearing about the possibility of creating a Bitcoin reserve, the way we have a petroleum reserve. From what you understand about cryptocurrency, does that make any sense?
Well, I don't think it does, and I'll tell you a couple reasons why. It is the case that the government owns a lot of Bitcoin because it seizes that Bitcoin in criminal activities, the same way it might seize stocks and bonds and houses and artwork. I don't think it makes sense to hold on to that Bitcoin because with anything we seize, with anything the government seizes, the policy is to sell it in due course. Now, that sometimes takes some time, but the policy is to sell it. I don't think we should make an exception. The argument for making an exception, I think, is that, well, its value is going to go up. And this is a way to show that we're going to be a leader in this technology. I don't think either of those justifies it. The value might go up, but it might go down also. And, unlike oil, there's no strategic purpose to Bitcoin. Some people are arguing that not only should we hold on to the Bitcoin we have, but we should go out and buy more. That's just going to favor the people who already own Bitcoin. Because if the price goes up, they're winners, but I don't see it as being in the national interest.
Up next, taking a hard look at funding for the U.S. Department of Education. That's ahead on Wall Street Week. This is a story about doing without, recognizing our limits and facing the consequences of testing them, particularly when it comes to things we care deeply about, things like education.
I'm going to close the Department of Education and move education back to the states. And we're going to do it fast.
In campaigning for president this year, Donald Trump made eliminating the Department of Education a priority for his new administration, which could help with his plan to reduce government spending overall. But what would that entail? And what would it mean for the nearly 50 million U.S. public school students? The Department of Education was created under President Jimmy Carter in 1980 and started with 3,000 employees and a budget of just over $14 billion. Today, it employs 4,400 employees, and its budget has grown to over $82 billion. But that's just its operating budget. It's also responsible for dispersing over $240 billion for schools and student resources, from kindergarten through grad school, with the lion's share of it coming in the form of student loans and grants for higher education.
The federal government needn't be doing many of these things. And we're going to have to get into a mode where the federal government limits itself to must-do items.
This is like standard Republican orthodoxy, abolish the Department of Education, blah, blah, blah. And it's, okay, next. Obviously, this seems, a little more serious this time, but, time will tell. The Congress obviously is going to have its bite of the apple.
Before we can even consider eliminating the Department of Education, we need to understand exactly what it does.
The Department of Education is responsible for a lot of funding for higher education and K-12 education. Actually, about 75% of the department is focused on higher education through the form of financial aid, Pell Grants, support for college and university students. The rest of the House is focused on elementary and secondary education through Title I funding and the Office of Special Education. There are other things like career and technical education and the Office of Civil Rights that supervises and oversees things like Title IX.
Margaret Spellings served as the 8th Secretary of Education under President George W. Bush. She now heads the Bipartisan Policy Center, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. American public schools receive only 11% of their funding from the federal government. But the lion's share of money coming from the Department of Education has nothing to do with K through 12 public schools. It goes instead for college educations.
The first thing that has to happen is a clear-eyed diagnosis of where the biggest bang for the buck can be found. And I would commend the higher ed side of the House probably is the riper work.
Mitch Daniels ran the USOMB, the state of Indiana as governor, and Purdue University as president. As a vocal critic of the Department of Education, he doesn't see much downside to eliminating it altogether.
When you look at it through a competency lens, it has failed utterly at its mission. Look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress scores today versus back at the time of its inception. I think it'd be a great object lesson to the country if we actually stopped doing anything federally that's important. You would see, as I've sometimes glibly said, you'd be amazed how much government you'd never miss. You would not miss. You'd hear the screams of the clients and recipients of the money, but the average person would not see any difference in their lives, and that might embolden the country to support other trimming and reductions and modernizations of the kind we really need. The Department of Education is doing some things it ought not be doing, other things it's doing that might be legitimate, and I'll say helping somehow finance student education, is doing so poorly that someone else should do it. There's a lot of suggestion, move that whole loan mess over to the Treasury. Another idea would be to sell it to the private sector. But in any event, they have failed utterly and clearly should be out of that business. What does it leave? Perhaps to support state and local educators in doing what has always been really in their province. You could support them financially without all the encumbrances that come with a federal department and without its cost.
The DOE contribution to K through 12 public school budgets may be modest, but talk to someone who runs those schools, someone like Sherry Cammey, superintendent of the Baldwin, New York Union Free School District.
Welcome to middle school.
Great. And you get a somewhat different sense. How big is the budget of your school district, and how much of it comes from the Department of Education?
So our budget coming from federal funding is just under $2 million a year, which represents 1.14% of our total budget.
What does that mean? If that money went away, how would it affect Baldwin school students?
So it sounds like it's a small amount of money, and it sounds like a small percentage, but in fact, it is a lot of money for us. Our federal money helps support the programs that we run for our students with disabilities. It helps us run programs for our Title I students, which are students that are below the poverty line. And it helps us with the students who are most in need in our school community. At that 1.14%, that is a tipping point. If we lose that money, we lose programs and we lose the ability to support those students.
If that money went away at the federal level, is it possible that you could get it replaced at the state level or even the local level?
A good percentage of our state funding is coming from the federal government as well. And so when you think about the flow of funds, if the state gets less money, then the school district is going to get less money in terms of our aid from the state. If the federal government gives less money, then we're going to see less money coming directly from the federal government.
Quite apart from the role of the Department of Education in doling out funds to public schools, educators like Cammey say it's also important that we have a federal agency that focuses specifically on education and acts as an advocate for education in Washington.
So obviously the funding is important, but the way that the Department of Education understands education, the way that it advocates for public school systems is imperative. The majority of kids in our country go to school in public schools, and public schools, in fact, are the bedrock of democracy for this country. And so when you think about eliminating the department, you're really also talking about eliminating the greatest advocate for public schools and for our nation's children. I guess my question would be, is that really what we want to do? Do we want to put the role of education in the hands of somebody who maybe that's not their primary goal or it's not of primary importance? For me personally, I think our kids are the most important thing that we treasure and value in our nation. And so for me, I want to make sure that our children are taken care of.
The money provided by the Department of Education for local public schools may make a difference. Its advocacy on behalf of public school students may be important, but that doesn't begin to address the bulk of the over $170 billion going to college student aid in the form of loans and grants every year. What about that student loan program? Does it make money for the U.S. government or lose money?
No, it's losing hundreds of billions of dollars. When the federal government under President Obama took it over, nationalized it essentially, we were told it was going to make money, but that's proven to be the reverse of the truth. It's quite possibly this is a stiff competition. It's at least a contender for the most catastrophically failed federal domestic program that we've seen.
The story is a bit different when it comes to those grants for less fortunate students, though Daniels sees room for reform there as well, and isn't sure the Department of Education is needed to administer them.
I think the Pell Grant program, properly aimed, is very, very worthy, and could honestly be expanded if you didn't have all the rest of the department to pay for. Once again, though, the money could be and the program could be decentralized. Doesn't need to be run command and control style from Washington.
And then there's the basic question of whether we should be urging so many of our high school graduates to go to four-year colleges to begin with. There's been a lot of emphasis on everybody going to college, particularly a four-year college. Is it time to revisit that anyway?
I think it absolutely is, and it's being revisited all over the country. And one of the things that the new nominee for the secretary has been a strong supporter of apprenticeship programs. We have workforce programs scattered throughout the federal government. The ones that are focused in high schools and community colleges live at the Department of Education. Many of them live at the Department of Labor.
There are twice as many Americans who started college and didn't finish. Many of them because of that went down the student loan path we talked about. There are twice as many such people as all the 18 to 22-year-olds on college campuses. And if we could help find more of those people than we do today, help them get to a new skill, a new credential that would allow them to advance themselves in life, I think that could be money well spent, better than much of what we do presently.
With all the disparate views about the value of the Department of Education and whether it should be preserved, there is one thing everyone appears to agree on: the purpose, which should be to prepare students to join the modern workforce.
As I talk to business leaders around the country here as a part of the Bipartisan Policy Center, that you hear it from every CEO. Every single entity is worried about the quality of their workforce. That is what is going to drive their growth. And that's what it's going to drive our country's growth too. And so, yeah, I think it is a national imperative. Can we have a lighter hand? Can we be more about a research agenda? Can we be more about data and accountability as opposed to telling them what to do, telling them what we desire instead? Yeah, I think there's, we're constantly recalibrating the federal role.
So if I'm a CEO of a big company or I'm a big investor, what does this all mean for me? Why do I care about what you do every day?
So the relationship between public schools and industry and CEOs in industry is underrated. There is a direct link to what we do and what industry does. If I'm a CEO of a company, I want the most prepared, the smartest, the most independently thinking, critical thinkers that I could possibly employ.
Coming up, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers is back with more views on taxing inheritance, plus the deficit and budget problems around the world. Larry Summers' life experience may have changed his perspective since he was a graduate student writing about the transfer of wealth between generations all the way back in 1981. But the amount of wealth being transferred has changed as well, helped along by U.S. tax policy.
I think asset values have just soared. Stock market's gone way up. Houses have gone up more than the rest of the economy. So aged people have a lot of wealth and they don't live forever, and then it passes. So my guess is that if you count what happens when somebody gets an inheritance and then they invest it and that builds up more wealth, that probably the vast majority, certainly a majority, of the wealth in our economy is related to inheritance. And that's, of course, a complicated thing. On the one hand, there'll be about $2.5 trillion of wealth passing this year. The collections on the inheritance tax are only going to be about 1% of that $2.5 trillion. Of course, relatively limited inheritances shouldn't get taxed. Of course, you have to treat family farms in appropriate ways. But $2.5 trillion passing, and the vast majority of that being among 5% or 1% of the people who die, and only collecting 1% of it in taxes, I do think we can do better.
Well, let me just pursue that a bit in the stepped-up basis phenomenon, because in some ways it's even more extreme. Because if I've earned a lot of wealth, but I owe some taxes on that if I sell it because of the appreciation. If I die, my heirs get it as if it were the basis were equal to when I passed on. That tax goes away altogether.
I think it's pretty much an indefensible tax provision in terms of logic and fairness. The reason it happens is, imagine a family business, and imagine a family business that's worth $50 million or worth some large amount of money, but it's an ongoing business. If you tried to collect a tax right then and there on that business, the business might have to be liquidated or sold and forced out of the family. Now, in fact, if you just said that not that you were going to collect taxes when a person died, but just that if their heir sells the business, they have to pay taxes on the whole gain, not just the gain that existed from the heir, then you wouldn't really have that problem. So I think it's sort of indefensible on logical and moral principles.
Does the inheritance situation right now potentially change the incentives for us during our working lives? I mean, there are those of us who thought that basically the way I accumulate wealth is by working really hard, doing a good job, getting a better pay raise, and maybe some bonuses along the way. And now a lot of people are actually accumulating wealth in a very different way.
I don't think there's a large number of people in the economy who are inheriting so much money that they just decide not to work, because there are not that many families where it's possible to give enough money to eliminate the incentive to work. And many of the people who earn the largest sums are believers in drive and determination and don't want to give their children enough money that their children won't be motivated to work. So I don't think that is a large problem based on what I hear and see, though it certainly is something that happens.
From an economics point of view, why do we have inheritance at all? I mean, why do we get to inherit wealth from our parents or our grandparents?
Well, I suppose the argument is, and I think it's a legitimate argument, that I ought to have a choice as to what I do with my wealth. And I can use it to buy a vacation house, I can use it to buy expensive cars, or I can use it to pass it to my kids to give them a chance. And should I be stopped from giving my money to my children or to anything else? So in some sense, it would be a pretty radical position that would say we weren't going to allow people to pass money on or to pass support on to their children or their relatives. My own view is that that's an okay thing.
So Larry, the deficit is on people's minds to some extent. We have a nominee for Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, saying he wants to get the deficit down to 3%, which is a feat. And we now have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy coming in with their Doge Committee. How difficult is it going to be to get that down to 3% or to cut $2 trillion out of the budget?
The deficit should be on people's minds because ours is unsustainable and ultimately will lead to some kind of serious financial trouble. So it should be in focus. I think it's going to be a lot harder to fix it without making painful choices just by being more efficient. The federal government has a payroll that is far less than the $2 trillion that Elon talks about. So even if you cut out the whole payroll, you wouldn't hit the saving target. Most of what the federal government does is support our national defense, and we're probably going to need to do more of that, and give money in one form or other to seniors, and that's going to be enormously difficult to change politically. So I think we're either going to have political courage to tell people that things they felt entitled to for a long time, they're not going to be entitled to, or the direction I would prefer, political courage to raise taxes to recognize that we now have more national defense needs than we do before. An aging population means we have more Social Security needs than we had before, and a changing structure of the economy means that things like healthcare and education that the government buys are more expensive than before.
Budgets are hard things, but not just in the United States. We have France, now with the government collapsing because they couldn't agree on the budget. We have South Korea, martial law, turning around a budget. Germany with a problem, besides the United States. What do you make of all the really political upturning around the world?
I think we have entitled societies that haven't come to peace with what's necessary to meet the entitlements, and that it has gotten harder to be the government for the kind of reasons that I was saying. A much larger fraction of the population is old. The things the government buys, healthcare, for example, have gone up faster in price than other things. There are increasing national security needs for most countries. And I don't think that citizens understand that and recognize it. And so they're in protest at the fundamental adjustments that need to be made. You can make them in different ways. You can make them by reducing the spending and benefits to which people feel entitled, or you can do them by raising the revenue collections, but you have to do it one way or the other. And I don't think our leaders have been able to persuade people of that need. And that's what is, I think, fundamentally behind the conflict in many countries.
That does it for us on Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. We'll see you again next week for more stories of capitalism.